Alright, guys, so today we're diving into NATO's increasingly murky involvement in Ukraine. Recently, discussions about NATO military instructors being in or not being in Ukraine have raised some serious questions. Why all the secrecy? What's behind the vague denials and evasions? To unpack this, I've got two revealing articles. One from the New Voice of Ukraine, titled Ukrainian Talks to Bring in EU Military Instructors, and another from Newsweek titled NATO Member Tells Alliance Not to Send Troops to Ukraine. I will be breaking this down into 5 key points, uncovering NATO strategies, the risks of escalation, and the larger geopolitical implications of what's unfolding in Ukraine. So, let's get into it. The first, NATO's growing involvement in Ukraine. From the New Voice of Ukraine. Ukraine's talk with the EU over bringing in military instructors points to a growing NATO presence, even if it's officially non combat. The goal is to enhance Ukraine's military capabilities, particularly in modern warfare techniques and equipment handling. However, there is a risk that NATO might eventually shift from training to direct combat assistance. So, why does this matter? Although the instructor's role is framed here as support, this could really pave the way for further military aid, eventually leading to more direct involvement than it currently is. It's a very slippery slope where a currently limited presence could expand. As NATO faces increased pressure to safeguard its personnel and interests in Ukraine, military instructors will be required for more logistical support, such as transportation, accommodations, and security, which would lead to more NATO personnel on the ground. NATO instructors may be exposed to dangerous situations, making them targets for Russia, potentially justifying additional military presence for protection. As instructors are embedded more deeply with Ukrainian forces, NATO may be pressured to provide direct combat support, increasing its footprint in Ukraine. So, regardless if the instructors are in Ukraine, they'll be targeted by Russian Air Force, missiles, and drones. However, I will say this, just to be fair here, that if NATO members want to be smart, just keep training them in their own countries, or rather close to Ukraine, in all honesty, instead of giving more reasons for Russia's special military operation that they started 2 years ago because of this. And yes, I know that since 2014 to the present, NATO has been training soldiers within Ukraine on using NATO doctrines for war. Basically, what NATO is doing here is creating another South Vietnam like move. And what I mean by this, the more NATO instructors are removed and or injured, they can use that as a means to justify sending more than just NATO instructors into Ukraine. Smart move, but it's already been done. And Russia is aware of this kind of play, mind you. The second, contradictory military support. From Newsweek, Estonia expresses concerns that NATO's military aid, though crucial, could inadvertently lead to deployment of troops under the pretext of training. Estonia's leaders fear that NATO trainers could eventually be drawn into active combat roles, contradicting the alliance's official non-combat stance. So Estonia's fears does highlight the secrecy of NATO's current position. While the support is framed as non-combative, the logistics and realities of war could quickly turn training missions into direct interventions. NATO's refusal to officially deploy troops may continue the conflict with operational needs on the ground, particularly if Ukraine faces more intense Russian pressure, of course. Estonia is particularly aware of NATO's past experiences where non combat roles escalated into full scale missions, such as in Afghanistan. As NATO sends more instructors, Russia could see them as combatants, compelling NATO to take action to protect its personnel. A growing NATO presence could force Estonia and other NATO members to reconsider their commitments to avoiding direct military involvement in Ukraine. It's very interesting that all of the NATO states besides Hungary and Slovakia, that Estonia, which has a massive historical fear of Russia, is the one who is speaking common sense here. Again, NATO is playing up to the public that it's just instructors that will be going to Ukraine, if they decided to do that, as the war rages on. But there are massive issues here. People in most Western countries are catching on to this slow creep of sending their fellow countrymen to far off places, coming back home and putting them in caskets, with made up reasons for why that happened. They don't want that anymore, and I would agree with them. I think Estonia is actually understanding this. However, their people would be more inclined and apathetic in the way NATO would portray mission creep in Ukraine, for obvious reasons. 3. The risk of escalation. From the New Voice of Ukraine. Military instructors, while presented as neutral, are at risk of becoming involved in combat. If Ukraine faces dire situations, the EU's intention is to bolster Ukraine's defense, but sending more NATO personnel increases the risk of direct escalation, potentially triggering broader military involvement. Now, the presence of NATO trainers could create a situation where their safety is compromised, leading to greater military intervention. Historically, missions billed as adversary have often expanded into full-scale operations. As external forces become more embedded within the conflict, NATO must walk carefully here to avoid becoming entangled in this kind of escalation. NATO instructors could inadvertently become involved in combat scenarios, particularly if Ukrainian forces are under attack, leading to potential casualties. If NATO instructors are harmed, it may force NATO to escalate its involvement to defend its personnel, turning an advisory role into a direct military intervention. The situation could quickly escalate beyond the scope of just training, requiring NATO to respond to an increased threat to its own personnel or strategic interests. So, let's be real here. Those instructors are already in Ukraine, and most of you don't even know it, except for those who know, of course. The only issues, besides what I stated earlier, is that the West will use mission creep tactics as much as possible to get the West to fully commit to sending all of NATO into Ukraine, leading to World War III as we know it. Those instructors have been reported missing or injured or somehow passed away in a training accident, which means when Russia targets key places that have NATO instructors there, you can see why they haven't been caught for a reason, excluding the volunteers, of course. It would be foolish to think that NATO isn't ready for the world to know of their actions in Ukraine, but they have a plan just as much as any organization does. Then again, there really hasn't been any pushback on NATO tactics, like those mentioned above, from other bigger players in the world in regards to actually imposing sanctions on the West, or even making threats to take over other countries, or even providing military assistance and aid to enemy countries against the West. Make with that as you will. 4. The debate of troop deployment. From Newsweek. Estonia warns about the slippery slope of sending instructors to Ukraine, highlighting how small NATO presence could easily morph into a larger commitment. The concern is that while trainers are sent to teach, these individuals could be drawn into combat scenarios, leading to more NATO troops being deployed to protect their instructors. Well, the debate revolves around whether sending trainers to Ukraine is truly a non-combative mission, or thinly veiled step toward a more significant military commitment. NATO's reluctancy to deploy combat forces could continue to be tested by dynamics on the ground, with public positions diverging from operational realities if instructors face problems. Sending NATO instructors could actually lead to justification for additional NATO troops to be deployed for protection, or if training becomes more operationally necessary. NATO's public stance on not deploying combat troops would be tested if the instructor's role evolves into one that requires combat defense. Estonia's concerns are based on historical precedents, where small commitments have led to broader military operations once forces were embedded in the conflict. Like I said, NATO isn't trying to avoid any miscommunications of its intentions to those who understand how the game works. Rather, they're doing it covertly. And then, depending on how things go next year in 2025, they might just go full blown out in the open, with their instructors being there, and perhaps letting them join the fight as well. I mean, come on. Who do you really think is operating those sophisticated weapon systems from the West? That would take a few years for the Ukrainians to actually learn. Just think about it. However, this does show that not all NATO members are on board with such tactics, even though some of them have historical issues with Russia. They would rather use tactics currently in use, though a bit less out in the open, than what the new NATO leader would like to do, of course. Now, the other NATO members are more or less inclined to send more instructors into Ukraine because of mass desertion of the Ukrainian soldiers on the front line, which are needed, of course, but for another reason as well. With Ukraine requesting their fighting age male population back, they would prefer the NATO instructors to compensate for the lack of manpower Ukraine lacks as it is, in my opinion. The 5th, reality of NATO's presence in Ukraine. From the new voice of Ukraine, NATO's stance of not deploying combat troops is increasingly difficult to maintain. With growing numbers of trainers and advisors in Ukraine, the line between non-combatant and combatant becomes more difficult to define, as these instructors engage with Ukrainian forces who are actively involved in combat. So, why does this matter? Well, despite NATO's official denials, a significant presence of military advisors or trainers could evolve into de facto troop deployment. The escalating nature of this conflict could force NATO to make decisions it has so far avoided, such as defending its personnel or getting more directly involved in operations. What starts as limited support risks becoming a larger entanglement, especially with changing battlefield dynamics as it currently is. The more NATO personnel that are in Ukraine, the harder it becomes to maintain the claim of non combat roles, especially as instructors engage with combat troops. As NATO presence grows, Russia may interpret their involvement as direct participation, leading to confrontations and expanding NATO's engagement. If instructors face military threats, NATO might feel compelled to escalate its defensive efforts, drawing the alliance deeper into the conflict, despite the initial claims of neutrality. So, Russia won't change its course in the war, even if the NATO instructors all come out in the open. They already knew for some time that they were already helping the Ukrainians. Now, NATO can adjust its strategies here, but that would require secrecy in its planning and hybridized warfare tactics in its actions, as much as the Russians are currently doing. It could cause more of a slowdown on the front line, though that depends on how much the West is willing to continue to spend its money and sending all of its weapon stockpiles to Ukraine. By looking at the current state of the world, it could be its fatal error to go all in by doing mission creeps for NATO as explained. So, my final thoughts on all of this. I obviously see this as an escalatory move and proposition by Western leaders. They have invested too much into Ukraine, more than any other place currently, in my opinion. That realistically that they're just getting more arrogant about it now, more so than ever, regarding instructors being involved than need be. I do want to mention something. Back in August of this year, Sweden, who is a NATO member, sent a few aircraft pilot instructors to teach a few Ukrainians to use their reconnaissance plane, that they will be transferring to them, of course. And well, the Russians caught wind of this. They hit the school, of course, that they were teaching in. It is speculated they passed away due to an accident in the school, causing one of Sweden's defense officials to resign a day after that. Interesting, right? So, it does show NATO has limits to how the instructors can feasibly operate in Ukraine. But the question is, will they get rid of their optics and just admit to their own people they do want their own citizens to pass away in this conflict in an apathetic way that they will be escalating in Ukraine? Is the question. So, if you like this video, leave a like and subscribe to my channel. I greatly appreciate it, guys. Have a great day.